Dr. DeMarte, please take the stand. Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. You may continue.
Good morning, Dr. DeMarte. All right, yesterday we talked a little bit about some of your work that you did with sexually violent persons, right?
That's correct.
And also the psychosexual risk assessments that you did?
I don't believe we spoke about those.
You did
but
those?
I have done those.
Okay. And so, and we were talking about dealing with people who have sexual issues, right?
Yes.
Okay. And when you are doing these evaluations with these people, it is generally post-arrest, isn't it?
Yes.
And so they've already been in trouble with the law.
That's correct.
But you would agree that before they get arrested, these types of people will do things to evade getting arrested, right?
That's correct.
And you're familiar with, based on this experience, you're familiar with sexual deviancy, right?
Yes.
Can you tell us what sexual addiction is?
Sexual addiction or sexual deviancy?
Sexual addiction.
Sexual addiction is the addiction to sexual behavior.
All right. And what about pedophilia? Can you tell us what that is?
Sure. Pedophilia is defined in the DSM as an interest to prepubescent children, a sexual interest.
Sexual interest. Okay. All right. I want to go back to your CV to talk about your conference presentations. Do you need a copy of it?
Yes.
Okay. All right, I'm handing you what's been marked as Exhibit 624.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so with regard to your conference presentations, according to your CV, is it true that the most recent presentation you had was in 2007?
Yes.
And that's prior to being licensed, right?
Yes.
And that type of presentation was a poster presentation, right?
Yes.
Meaning, what is a poster presentation?
It's presenting research data at a conference.
Okay, and that research data is presented on a poster, right?
It's in an exhibit kind of form, yes.
All
and
right.
there's a bunch that it's usually in a large area, and there's a bunch of researchers that are presenting their data there.
Okay, and so people can walk around and view what's on these exhibits, right?
And discuss the data, yes.
All right, but it's not actually standing up in front of your peers and actually presenting in a lecture type format, right?
Not in a lecture format.
And prior to this one, you had another poster presentation in 2006?
Yes.
And that had to do with empathy and disregard for others in children exposed to intimate partner violence. Is that right?
That's correct.
And was that part of some of your studies with regard to your thesis, master's thesis?
Yes.
So based on your studies with your master's, you are aware that children are affected when there's domestic violence in the home, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And you're aware that when children are exposed to domestic violence, it can cause them problems in their future.
Yes, that's correct.
And in fact, you're aware then that the studies show that men more often tend to turn into batterers if they're going to turn into something, right?
Could you rephrase that?
That men, so in other words, a boy as a child who's exposed to domestic violence in the home, studies show that more often that person is going to turn into a batterer versus a victim.
That's been found to one of the factors that contribute to the development of battering behavior.
Okay, and so also you were aware of the research that women or a girl who's a child in a home that has violence in it, more often research shows will turn into a victim rather than a batterer.
That's inaccurate. There's research that shows that they could go either way. Again, that's just one factor that contributes to any kind of perpetrating behavior.
So you disagree then, so that there is no research having to do with a woman most likely turning into, if she's going to turn into anything, becoming a victim versus a batterer.
I agree there's research that suggests that that kind of exposure to domestic violence can lead to that kind of behavior,
Okay,
either
that's what
victim
I'm
or
asking.
perpetrator.
Objection, she's not allowed to finish her response.
I think she did. She's not
Did you
talking.
finish your response?
Yes.
And you're aware that the research shows that the greater the violence is in the home, the more effect it has on the child, right?
Yes.
And prior to that, you did another poster presentation in 2005, right?
Yes.
And before that, it looks like you have 4 other presentations that are earlier than 2005?
Yes.
And 3 of those were poster presentations? And you're reviewing your
Yes.
CV, right?
I am. Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and one of those was a paper presentation?
Yes,
And in these 4, you were not listed as the lead presenter in any of them, right?
that's correct.
And so if you haven't had any conference presentations since 2007, that would mean that you haven't had any conference presentations since you were licensed, right?
Right. Most of my work is as a clinician. I don't present as in conferences. That's not
Okay.
something that I do as part of my career.
All right. Well, today and yesterday, you're testifying not as a clinician, right? You're being used as a forensic expert.
That's a clinician.
Well, you're not treating anybody here, right?
A clinician does evaluations and treatment.
Okay. But you're being hired to testify about an evaluation, right?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. Let's talk about publications. Do you know can you tell us what peer review is?
Yes, it's a strenuous process of once a research article has been written based on research that's been conducted by the person, it gets sent out to other individuals in the field to ensure that it has good quality of work.
Okay. And you have, well, let's see, you have 2 publications listed in your CV, right?
That's correct.
One from 2004 and one from 2006?
That's correct.
And both of those, you are not the lead author, right?
That's correct.
And both of these are prior to becoming or getting your license, right?
Yes.
And part of your education was doing your master's thesis, we just talked about, right?
Correct.
That was not peer-reviewed or published, right?
Correct.
And part of getting your doctorate degree was writing a dissertation, yes?
Correct.
And that your dissertation was not peer-reviewed or published.
Right, I didn't pursue that.
So it wasn't.
Correct.
All right. Now currently you are in your own practice, is that right?
Yes.
And that's after you left Bayliss Behavioral Health?
Correct.
What was the reason for leaving Bayliss?
Wanted to start a private practice.
Okay, so you were with Bayliss with your license for approximately 2 years before you started your private practice, right?
Correct.
And when you started Bayliss in, let's see, you were licensed in August of 2010, right?
July of 2010.
July of 2010. And a year later, after your license, that's when you began evaluating Miss Arias, right?
Yes, July of 2011.
Okay, so a year after you got your license is when you began this evaluation.
Correct.
Now, right now, with regard to what you do in your own practice, you have, you do civil evaluations, civil and criminal forensic evaluations?
In addition to other work.
Okay, but that's part of what you do, right?
Correct.
And you conduct therapy.
Correct.
You do psych testing
Correct.
on adults and children?
Primarily adults.
Primarily, okay. And you do this testing, you use assessment tools, right?
Yes.
And what type of tests are you familiar with now that you use in your practice, besides what we've talked about yesterday?
New tests?
Any other testing tools that you use in your practice now that we didn't talk about yesterday?
I listed a number of them yesterday. There's several that I didn't list yesterday just because I asked you if you wanted me to continue. You said no.
So
I
what
use
are
the
those?
same kinds of tests, some new tests potentially in my new practice. I use what's called the R bands,
Okay, what's that for?
neuropsychological damage.
Okay. And anything else new?
New? No.
Okay. All right. Now do you have any other doctors working for you?
I have 2 psychologists that work under my contract
Is that a contract with the county,
with the state
the state? What kind of contract is that?
to do disability evaluations.
Okay. And so those are licensed psychologists, right?
That's correct.
And so those licensed psychologists, they do some of the contract work for disability then,
Under my contract,
under your contract? And do you also do that too?
yes.
All right. As part of having your own practice, you have an advertisement, don't you?
Advertisement?
Yes. In Psychology Today?
That's a website.
It's a website, but it's a website, yes, but you also, in addition to Psychology Today website, you also have your own website
My
talking
private
about your
website.
practice, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so the website Psychology Today it's an advertisement, isn't it? Talking about what you do?
Yes.
Do you have to pay to post on this?
I have not paid.
Do you have to?
I haven't paid thus far.
Okay, have they requested it and you just didn't? Or?
No.
Okay, you just haven't needed to.
Right, I haven't needed to pay.
All right. And when you post on this Psychology Today, you create what you want them to say about you, right?
I write it.
You write it. So what we see on the advertisement in Psychology Today is what you've written.
Yes.
And you give a summary, basically you give a summary of what you do and what your beliefs are with regard to your practice, right?
Correct.
And in here you say that you offer a free consultation.
That's part of the website that comes with Psychology Today. That's verbiage that they use.
Oh, so you didn't write that part.
Right, I didn't write that part.
Okay, but you do offer a free consultation, right?
If a patient is interested in therapy and they call me, yes.
Okay. And they talk about the average cost per session, $130 to $200?
Yes.
Is that per hour?
For therapy,
I don't know, it just says $130 to $200.
those are the ranges that they also put up there.
So that's not your
That's per
range?
hour. Right. Well, that's the range I fall into. They had categories to choose from.
Okay. And so if you wanted to charge more, then you couldn't?
I charge the same across the board for differences between forensic and non-forensic work. So this is the non-forensic.
Right, and so non-forensic work, then what do you charge?
For therapy,
Yes,
$125.
okay. And it talks about how it has whether or not you have a sliding scale, and the answer is no. Did you
Right.
write that part?
It was a box to check.
Okay, so you checked the box no.
Right.
So in other words, with a sliding scale, that would mean if somebody couldn't afford the $125 an hour and didn't have insurance, they would have to look elsewhere.
Right.
Okay. And you also accept insurance, right?
Yes.
And on this website, there's a list of the different insurance companies that you will accept.
That's correct.
And isn't it true that if somebody walks in with insurance, you're contracted with that insurance company to accept less per hour than what you would get if somebody just walks in and paid you cash?
We're required to follow the contracted rate.
Right, and the contracted rate is less than what you would get if somebody walked in paying cash.
Right.
Do you know approximately how much it is, or does it vary?
It varies.
Okay, but it's less than $125 an
It
hour.
is. For some, not for all.
Okay, but it's less than what you would charge privately.
For some,
So sometimes with insurance, you're going to get paid more than what you would get if they walked in the door paying cash?
not more, equivalent.
Oh, equivalent, okay. And I want to contrast that then with your forensic service, because this advertisement, like you told us, is just with regard to your non-forensic services, right?
I don't believe I said anything about forensics in there. It's possible.
Okay. Well, when we're talking about money and things like that.
Oh, that's
Is that
correct.
right? Okay. So forensic services, that means that you are hired to evaluate somebody and you're getting paid by either a prosecutor or a defense attorney or a plaintiff's attorney, something like that, right?
Or the court.
Or the court, right?
Correct.
Okay. And in forensic work, you charge $300 an hour for testimony, right?
Testimony.
And $250 an hour for non-testimony?
Right.
And
And-
is there another charge?
Well, $300 also for pretrial interviews.
Okay, so $300 an hour. So yesterday when you're testifying and then today you're making $300 an hour, right?
That's correct.
And you'd agree that's significantly more than somebody who walks in to get therapy from you.
That's correct.
So if you're doing forensic work, that's going to bring you in a lot more money than it is somebody coming in off the street for therapy.
From an hour-to-hour basis, yes.
Yes. How many forensic cases have you had since you started your own practice?
Currently I have 6 open cases, and I have 2 others that I've completed since.
Okay, so a total of 8?
Yes.
All right, and do you know how many you were hired by the prosecutor?
Yes.
How many?
For my 6 open cases, I have, and you're talking about just criminal?
Well, no, I mean prosecutor would mean criminal. Was there any other?
So for my 6 open cases, I have 2 by the prosecutor, which includes this one.
Okay,
I have 1 by the defense attorney,
okay,
and I have 1 by the court,
okay.
and I have 2 civil cases. One I'm a consultant, and the other I've been hired as an expert witness by the defense.
Okay, and what kind of case is that? Is that criminal that you're hired by the defense?
Those last 2 are civil. I have 1 criminal defense.
Okay, so just 1 criminal defense that you're hired on.
Yes.
And when you
That's
worked for
open.
Bayliss, you also did forensic work, right?
Yes.
And for Bayliss, you also worked for the prosecutor, right? You were hired by prosecutors.
As much as the defense.
You would say it was 50-50?
When I was at Bayliss,
Yeah,
most of the work that I did, I was in conjunction with Dr. Bayliss.
right. But I was asking you that, are you telling me that when you worked at Bayliss, that you worked 50% of the time hired by the prosecutor and 50% of the time hired by defense?
Actually, more so related to the court. I was hired more often by the court.
Okay, so not 50-50 for prosecution and defense then?
I would say roughly, and by the court. I would say that there's an equal amount.
Well, I'm not talking about the court though. So I'm talking about prosecutors hiring you versus defense attorneys like me hiring you.
I wouldn't say that there was more prosecution. It was roughly 50-50. I would have to look at the numbers. That's not something that I keep track of.
Okay. Well, give me a sec. All right, you remember when we did an interview with you, the defense, Mr. Normey and I interviewed you
Yes.
in January of 2013, right?
Yes.
And we talked a little bit about this issue, right?
Yes.
And at that point in time, you told us that you had 2 criminal cases with the county attorney's office, right?
Correct.
And only 1 with the defense, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So not just 1 with the county attorney's office.
Well, I'm speaking about this case and another, that's consistent with what I just gave you right now.
2 cases with the county
Would you
attorney's
like me to
office.
review it again? I have 6 total cases open right now.
Okay. When we interviewed you,
Yes.
you talked about having 4 cases, criminal cases. Let's talk criminal, okay?
Okay.
Okay, you told us that you had 4 criminal cases, right?
I would review your notes on that. Does it say 4 criminal cases?
It does say 4.
So including this one?
Yes.
Judge Arias says you provided the transcript.
Yeah.
She's attempting to impeach her, for recollection.
Approach, please.
All right, so then, Dr. DeMarte, you'd agree that you have 2 cases with the county attorney's office, right?
Yes.
All right. Now, you told us that you spent 12 hours speaking with Ms. Arias, is that right?
Yes.
But you spent additional time over that to review the materials, didn't you?
Yes.
And did you review the materials prior to speaking with Jodi or after?
There was a lot of material, so I reviewed some of it before, some of it during, and some of it after.
So while she's talking to you, you were also reading the materials?
Oh, let me clarify. What I
Sure.
mean is during the same day, so not while she was talking to me, but maybe later that day or between sessions, so continually reviewing records.
All right. And so at the point that you finished your 12 hours with Jodi, were you still reading any more materials, or had you completed them all?
I had not completed them all.
Okay. And so after speaking with Jodi, then you continued reading the materials.
That's correct.
And you never went back to clarify anything with Jodi after you continued reading the materials, right?
That's correct.
You just spent the 12 hours
For
talking to her.
in interviewing and then more hours in testing.
Right.
That's correct.
But in testing, you're not actually interviewing her, right?
The day that I tested, I talked to her. I added some additional information, and you can see that in my notes.
So did you want to add to your 12-hour?
It was about 12 hours, and then the day that I tested her was about 5.5 hours.
Okay, and
So-
that 5.5 hours is testing, right?
I would say maybe about 15 to 30 minutes of that, I followed up with some questions for her.
Okay. And so really the time that you spent interviewing her would be 12.5 hours then?
Between 12 and 12.5, yes.
Okay. And about how many hours do you think you spent reviewing the case altogether?
A lot of time.
Which is what?
I can't give you a specific number, but there was a lot of records, as you know, a lot of videotapes to watch, police interviews. There was a significant amount of records, diary. If I gave you a number, I would be making it up. I don't know a specific number.
All right. Well, you had a bill for this time, didn't you?
I did.
Okay. Do you have an idea then what you billed for it?
I don't have my billing records. But I have spent a significant amount of time, more than I did in talking with her. And part of that was because I did find some inconsistencies of what she was saying.
Yeah. You know what? The interesting thing is you're talking to me about inconsistencies, but that's not what we're talking about. So what we're talking about.
Sustain,
Well,
rephrase.
what we're talking about here, Dr. DeMarte, is the hours you spent, okay? So
Okay.
the hours you spent with Jodi, you're telling me is 12 and a half, 12 to 12 and a half, right?
That's correct.
And you have no idea then how many hours you spent in addition to that reviewing these materials?
I can't give you a number, no.
Okay, even though you would have billed for it.
That's correct.
And for that, you would have billed $250 an hour, right?
That's correct.
And do you think it's over 100 hours?
I do not think so.
Do you
Off
think
the
it's
top
over
of my head.
50?
Probably, yes, over 50.
Over 50, okay. And that's all hours that you're billing to the prosecutor, right? His office is paying you.
Correct. I send my bill to him,
Right, and then,
except for the bill I sent to you.
right, and that was for the interview, right?
That's
that
correct.
Mr. Nurmi and I did with you.
Correct.
Besides speaking to Jodi for 12 or 12 and a half hours, you spoke to one other person, right?
Yes,
And that was Stephen Alexander?
yes,
That was about 30 minutes, right?
correct,
And that's it.
correct.
You didn't speak to anybody else.
I did not speak to anybody else.
You didn't do any other interviews.
That's correct.
And so all of the information that you have is based on your psychological testing, right?
And
That's part of it, right?
that's part of it.
And the materials you reviewed,
Correct.
and a 30-minute conversation with Travis's brother.
And behavioral observations.
Okay, and a 30-minute interview with Travis's brother,
Yes.
right? Okay. I want to go back to this advertisement in Psychology Today. In this, you list your qualifications, right?
I believe so.
Where you went to school
Yes,
and that you graduated in 2009.
yes,
It gives us your license number in Arizona.
yes,
And it also tells us that you have practiced for 8 years.
yes,
But as we established yesterday, you've been practicing as a psychologist really for just 3 years. Isn't that true?
yes.
Okay.
Since 2010.
Yes. And in your advertisement, you don't clarify what you mean by practice here. You just claim 8 years.
Right, because they don't have a space for that.
Okay, so it was okay to put 8 years, and even though it's really only been 3 years that you're practicing as a psychologist.
That's an incorrect statement. I have not been practicing for 3 years.
You've been practicing as a psychologist longer than that?
You're adding the word psychologist to it. I've been
Right.
practicing since 2004.
Well, so you've been practicing since 2004, but that was as a student, wasn't it?
In 2004, yes.
And you were supervised at that time.
Yes,
Okay, and so when you say practicing, starting in 2004, what you mean is you're practicing as a student who's being supervised by somebody who's actually licensed.
Right, and what that means is that I see my own patients. It's not as though the supervising psychologist is sitting in the room participating in the treatment or evaluation.
But you're being supervised,
Yes,
right?
I'm being
You're not
supervised.
allowed to do it without supervision.
That's correct.
And in fact, starting in 2004, that was when you had your master's, right?
That's incorrect.
When did you get your master's?
2005.
Okay, so you talk that you've been practicing even before you had your master's. You just had your bachelor's then.
I was in school seeing patients on a regular basis,
In school, earning your master's, right?
earning my master's.
Okay, so when you're earning your master's, you only have a bachelor's degree.
Yes,
Okay, so you consider having your bachelor's degree working towards your master's as practice.
yes,
Okay, and when you get your master's, you also consider that to be practice, that you're practicing.
just like other master's level counselors,
Right, but you didn't have a license, a therapist license, right?
because it was unnecessary.
But you didn't have one.
I didn't.
Okay, so when you're practicing with your master's, what are you practicing?
Therapy.
Okay, and so you're practicing therapy without a therapist license.
Right, that happens all the time. That's part of what happens in this field.
Okay, well, you're aware that Alice LaViolette, you spoke of her yesterday, right?
Yes,
And that she had her master's.
yes,
And in fact, besides her master's, she has a therapy license, right?
yes,
And that's what she practices, right?
yes,
But you were doing it without a license. You were waiting for your doctorate and your psychology license.
I wasn't waiting. I was going through the process of achieving my doctorate, and part of that is that we do therapy and evaluations throughout the years.
Okay. So when somebody comes in or calls your office from this advertisement and asks about your years in practice being 8 years, do you clarify with them
Oh,
that
absolutely.
this is a master's level practice and psychology is only 3 years?
As it lists on there, it shows when I got my license. So yes, absolutely, I can clarify with them if they ask.
If they ask.
Right, if they ask about my years of experience. In fact, I did that 2 weeks ago with somebody.
Okay, and you had to clarify it with them, right?
They had a lot of questions about my background. Yes, and I provided that information.
Okay. Also on this advertisement, there's a place to list specialties, right?
Yes,
And you have listed under specialties testing and evaluation, right?
yes,
And you've been doing that since 2004.
correct.
And personality disorders.
Yes,
And the third one you list is trauma and PTSD.
yes,
And you list that as a specialty.
yes.
Looking through your CV, though, where in here does it talk about expertise with regarding trauma?
That's a patient population that I've seen since 2004.
Trauma patients.
Yes,
So only trauma patients?
no,
Lots of different patients, right?
right,
And so you're including that some of your patients have had traumas to them, right?
right.
And so in your CV specifically, you don't list that you've had any specific interviews with trauma victims, right?
Because I don't list out my patients on there, that would be inappropriate.
Well, no, not their names, of course, but I mean, you're not on your CV, there's nowhere on here that you ever say that you conducted interviews with trauma patients, right?
That's correct, because if I did that, the CV would be 50 pages long, because then I'd have to list out every patient and type of evaluation and interview that I've done. It just seems unnecessary. I'd rather spend my time with my patients.
Well, you list only 3 specialties, right?
That was just for they had a random list of things to choose from, and those were the areas that I had a lot of experience in and really enjoy working in, so I listed those.
Right, so you chose to list these 3 specialties.
Yes,
And nowhere on your CV does it ever talk about you doing any specific research with trauma victims.
oh, sure it does. There's several of them on there.
Which ones?
We can go back to the research that we talked about yesterday,
Uh-huh.
the mother and infant study.
The one where from 03 to 04?
Sure, that one was specific to domestic violence.
Okay.
Also, all of the subsequent research when I was looking at the pattern of aggressiveness and antisocial behavior, the vast majority of those individuals had trauma backgrounds.
Okay, and so, but you don't list trauma in here, you're talking about antisocial. You specifically list antisocial behavior, right? In your CV?
I do,
But you don't specifically list trauma, do you?
right? Because I just don't feel it necessary to pad my CV.
I understand why you don't, but it's not listed, right?
That's correct for that.
And you don't list anywhere that you had teaching specific to trauma, right?
If you could, do you want to reference my teaching experience?
Sure. Well, I mean, do you have anywhere where you specifically list that you taught specifically about trauma?
Did I use the word trauma in my CV? No. Did I teach about trauma? Yes.
Okay, but then you didn't specifically list it out, right?
Right, in addition to every other area that I've lectured about, I did not list it out.
So there's additional teaching that you've done that you didn't list in your CV, is that what you're saying?
You know, for example, you're talking about trauma. I also didn't list schizophrenia in there. I also didn't list about bipolar disorder in there because it would make my CV extremely long. And the point is that I taught several courses at an undergraduate level on abnormal psychology. And that's a really important piece in there is trauma.
When you were an undergraduate or you taught to
No,
undergraduates?
when I was a graduate. When I was a graduate student, I taught 4 courses at Michigan State University independently.
Okay, and any of those courses titled trauma victims or anything to do with trauma?
No, it's titled abnormal psychology.
Okay, and so part of abnormal psychology that would touch on trauma, right?
Yes,
Okay, and that's what you're saying your teaching experience is?
that's one of my teaching experiences.
Okay, and you don't list any specific assessments that you've done with trauma victims, right?
For the same reasons.
Okay, and you don't have any publications having to do with trauma, right? You only have 2 publications to begin with, right?
And one publication is related to community violence, so that would be exposure to trauma.
Okay, and so did you talk specifically, I know we're talking about exposure to trauma, but did you talk specifically about trauma, the aspects of trauma, and the different instruments that are used to measure trauma?
No, it was about exposure to community violence and the effects that happen as a result of that.
Okay. And as far as being a member of associations, you're not a member of any specific trauma association, right?
That's correct. I'm a member of the large American Psychological Association and related.
Right, but you're not a member of any specific trauma association.
That's correct.
And you have, part of having your license these days, you have to keep up with education, don't you?
Yes,
You have to do continuing education so many hours a year?
yes.
And part of that is attending, do you attend conferences then?
You can.
Okay. Have you ever attended the International Society for Study of Trauma and Disassociation?
No,
You ever read that journal?
I can't say off the top of my head.
All right. Did you ever read the Journal for International Society for the Study of Traumatic Stress?
I can't say what journals I've read. I read journal articles multiple times a week.
Okay. But you can't specifically tell us that you've read either one of these specific trauma journals, right?
I don't know.
Have you ever even attended the International Conference of Violence, Abuse, and Trauma? It's given every year.
I don't believe so, no.
Okay. You also talked yesterday about some of the testing that you did, and some of the testing that you did, you gave the RAT, right?
Yes,
W-R-A-T.
correct.
And you took, and when you talk about the 5.5 hours you spent doing testing, is that part of the 5.5 hours?
Yes,
It's a pretty simple test though, right?
that's a very quick test.
Okay, and I think you described yesterday, is it just them being able to read words?
Yes,
And so you wanted to give this test to make sure that she could ultimately do the MMPI,
correct.
because you wanted to make sure she can read.
Right.
But prior to giving her the RAT, you had at least reviewed some of the material, hadn't you?
Yes,
And you had seen some of her journals?
yes,
And so from her journals, you see that she can write, right?
yes,
And in fact, she's really, you said, well, she writes quite a bit, right?
yes.
And based on that, you were still concerned that she couldn't read?
I wasn't concerned. I was engaging in good practice of ensuring that she would be able to do it.
So despite reading all her journals and despite talking to her, you felt it was good practice to administer a test to make sure she can read.
Yes, especially since it's such a brief test.
So you wanted to make sure she could read.
Yeah, yes,
And you also gave the WACE, right?
correct.
And the WACE is an overall intelligence test.
Yes,
And that basically gives an IQ score, doesn't it? Does it give an IQ?
yes, it does give an IQ score.
Okay. Prior to giving her the WACE, you had had some contact with her, right? You had had your 12 hours of time,
Yes,
and you were able to talk with her back and forth,
yes,
and you had read through some of her journals?
yes.
Had you read through the text messages back and forth between her and Mr. Alexander?
I don't remember at that time if I had gone through all of them, presumably some of them.
Okay, and you had read through some of the emails, maybe?
Yes,
And so, at that point in time, seeing her being able to follow conversations and having 12 hours with her where you're talking back and forth with her, you were still concerned that she had some kind of mental deficiency?
you're using the word concerned. I was being comprehensive. There was information in the data, being the records, that suggested that she had a sense of immaturity, and that's something that I observed also.
So the sense of immaturity means that she had a low IQ. Is that what you were worried about?
I was curious about what that immaturity could mean, because it could mean a broad variety of things, and so I wanted to be comprehensive and rule it out by giving an IQ test.
Okay, so comprehensive IQ. All right. So, and what you found out is that she actually has a pretty high IQ, right?
That's correct.
During both of these tests, these were two of the tests that took part of the 5.5-hour time, right?
Yes,
And during this time, you were being paid, what, $2.50 an hour?
that's correct.
Yesterday you spoke about the other testing and generally speaking, the objectivity of testing, right?
Yes,
And how you also spoke about having a lack of compassion when you're conducting these tests, right? And interviewing people.
a lack of compassion.
Right.
Can you clarify what you mean by that?
That you don't have a lot of compassion when you're doing these interviews, right?
What I said is that I don't walk in having compassion for the person immediately, and that it's possible to have compassion.
It's okay, so it's possible to have compassion, okay. But you were talking about making sure that this was a very objective test, right?
Yes,
And any interviews that you do would be objective
yes,
as possible.
yes,
So in that way, the test scores would mean a lot to you, wouldn't they?
if they're objective,
Yes.
yes, it's another data point,
Okay. Well, everything's a data point, right?
right?
I mean, if you talk to somebody over here, if you read something over here, you would classify all of that as data points, right?
I agree with that.
Okay. And so when you're doing these testing, you were talking about how these tests, different tests that you can do, are objective. Ultimately, these tests are computer scored, right?
Correct.
And so with the tests that you performed, the TSI and the MMPI, those are the two ones I'm talking about.
Okay.
Okay? Those are computer scored, aren't they?
The MMPI is computer scored, and the TSI is scored by hand, the version that I have.
Okay, so you didn't computer score the TSI.
That's correct.
You could have, right?
There's versions out there. That's not the one I had.
Okay. So you didn't have the Pearson version? Did you have a different version?
What I mean by that is there's different scoring sheets. The scoring sheet I had was a two-way scoring sheet. When you write on it, it kind of scores it behind the scenes automatically, and then you just have to tally up some stuff versus imputing it into a computer.
Okay, so you did it with hand scoring then?
Yes.
All right. But you would still consider that objective?
Yes.
So just because somebody does hand scoring doesn't mean it's a subjective test, right?
Unless the data is altered. If it's done per protocol, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, so in other words, if the person is hand scoring and done per protocol, you would agree that that's objective?
Yes.
All right, you talked a little bit about the PDS test yesterday, and that was something that Dr. Samuels gave, right?
Yes.
You didn't do that one.
No.
And the PDS test, you've only given that once before, isn't that right?
I've never given the PDS before.
You what?
I've never given the PDS before.
Oh, okay. And the PDS test, that is something specific for post-traumatic stress, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, and that's one of your specialties, right?
Right.
According to the website that you advertise on?
Yes.
And you've never given the post-traumatic stress test, the PDS test?
Right, because there's a number of other measures. I'm very familiar with Edna Foe's work, though. who's the creator of the test.
Who's the creator?
Edna Foa?
And you're familiar with the work, but you didn't own a copy of it, right?
Right.
And in fact, you had to go buy your own copy to understand what Dr. Samuels did.
Incorrect.
Well, you had to buy your own copy because you didn't have the test questions, right?
I didn't buy a copy.
Oh, did you borrow it from someone else?
I obtained a copy from a colleague who had it.
Oh, okay. So, because you didn't have it.
I did not have it.
All right. So, because, and what you had from Dr. Samuels was Jodi's answers to the PDS test, right?
That's all he gave me.
Okay. And so what you didn't have then was the questions of what the PDS test itself, right?
Right.
And that's what you say you borrowed from a colleague?
The actual test questions.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. And so because you haven't given the test before, you didn't really have any experience giving it then, right? Because you've never done it.
I didn't have experience giving that. It's a basic self-report measure, similar to many other measures.
So, but you didn't have any experience giving it.
Giving that one in particular, no.
Okay. And so the only way that you had the questions to the PDS test is because you had to go get them from a colleague. Is that right?
Yes,
And you weren't given them by the defense at all.
that's correct.
And those test questions, those are considered raw data, aren't they?
The test questions or the bubble sheet?
Well, both.
No, only the bubble sheet is considered raw data.
Okay, so the raw data then would be Jodi's answers, right?
That's correct.
All right, and the test questions, that's something that's created by the owners of the PDS test
Correct.
and the creators of the PDS test.
Correct.
And so, in fact, these owners, the people who do these tests or created these tests and own them are Pearson Assessments, right?
I think that's who distributes it. I don't know I don't know how their contract works. Edna Foa is the developer, I thought.
Right, well, there's a specific doctor who ultimately created the test,
Right.
right? Okay, and then once the doctor creates the test, it gets distributed by a company, right?
Sure, if that, I don't know the process.
Oh, all right. The company that owns the test now, and this is, and if you look at the PDS test, it has Pearson on it. Do you
Yes.
need to look at it?
No, I'm aware of that.
Okay, and so Pearson would be the people who have the copyright on this test, right?
Again, I'm not familiar with the laws pertaining to that, who has copyright, whether it's the developer of the test or Pearson.
Okay, well,
It's outside of my scope of knowledge.
all right, you've certainly seen different tests before, right? I mean, you've
Yes.
seen the MMPI, right?
I've seen many tests.
All right, I'm showing you exhibit number 550. That's the front page of the PDS, right?
Yes,
And you're talking about Edna Foa, right?
yes,
And you see at the bottom it says Pearson.
yes,
And you see at the bottom, we actually have a warning on it, don't we?
yes,
Okay, and this particular test is copyrighted, right? You're aware of how psychological tests are copyrighted, aren't you?
yes.
Okay, and so this particular test is copyrighted, right?
It looks like it, yes.
And according to this copyright, there's a warning on it that no part of this publication may be reproduced or transmitted in any form or by any means without, and then it goes on, without permission in writing from the copyright owner, right?
Yes,
Okay? And you work with multiple tests all the time that have copyrights, right?
yes,
You understand that part of the idea of this copyright is that if the questions on these tests are somehow released to the public, it could invalidate the test, couldn't it?
yes,
And that's the importance of why the questions are copyrighted.
yes,
Because if all of a sudden, all these test questions were released to the public, then everybody would understand, would be able to start practicing how to take these tests, right?
That's correct.
And it would make the test useless then.
Yes.
And it would make years of research useless
I think that's
in coming up with the
taking
test.
it a little bit far, but I think that it makes it difficult to then continue to use the test.
Right. So that's why it's important that these tests are copyrighted, right?
Yes.
So this information doesn't get released.
Yes.
Now you're saying, you told us that you had these test questions because you had to get them from a colleague, right?
Yes.
And in cross-examination of Dr. Samuels, are you aware that Mr. Martinez presented exhibit number 533?
He notified me of that
Okay, so he notified you that he was using the test questions, right?
after the fact.
After the fact.
Yes.
After the fact that he did it.
Yes.
Okay, so when this is typed up, right? This isn't what the actual test looks like, right?
That's not what the test looks like.
Okay.
Correct.
So to you, you can tell that this is something that has just been typed,
Yes.
not coming specifically from Pearson.
Correct.
All right. And so these particular questions then are the questions that are contained on the PDS test, right?
That's what you're telling me.
Do you want to look at it?
Sure. Without comparing it directly, I couldn't say if it was 100% item for item identical. Is that what the question is?
No, just generally speaking, do you know if these are the test questions?
The few that I saw when it was up there, yes, it looked very similar.
Okay, all right. And the only way that Mr. Martinez had these test questions is because he got them from you, right?
I didn't give them to him, no.
You never gave him the test questions?
We reviewed them together.
Oh, okay. So you didn't let him take home a copy.
That is correct. He did not take home a copy.
So at the time that you reviewed them together, he would have been copying them down, right? To get them word for word?
At the time that we reviewed them, we were sitting there and we were talking about the concept of PTSD. We were talking about the PDS, the test, and reviewing it together. And he asked to see the items so we could understand what I was talking about. Gave him the items and we sat there and we discussed it and he was taking notes as we were talking throughout our whole conversation.
And so throughout this conversation that you were talking to Mr. Martinez, you were talking to him and showing him the test questions, right?
In addition to a number of other things, yes.
Yes, you were showing him these test questions that are copyrighted, right?
I did show them to him, yes.
And you were aware at the time that Mr. Martinez is not a practicing psychologist, right?
That's correct.
He's not a mental health professional like you are,
Correct.
but you still shared the copyrighted information of those questions with him, right?
Yes.
All right, part of the PDS test, the part that you did get from Dr. Samuels was what you referred to as the raw data, right?
Correct.
And those are Jodi's answers.
Correct.
And during this test is broken up into different parts, isn't it?
Are you referring to the PDS?
Yes.
Yes.
And it's broken up with part one, it's discussing traumatic events, right?
Yes.
And in discussing traumatic events, it actually talks about, well, it actually asks you, let me just get the questions. It's asking questions about different traumatic events the person might have experienced, right?
Correct.
And if one of the traumatic events was not listed in the list on the test, it asks the person to list what traumatic event in addition they have, right?
Yes.
And you see that, again, this is exhibit 550. You see that Jodi answered that question, repeated emotional and psychological abuse, right?
Correct.
And you talk about, on part two, it asks for a description of the trauma that's bothering them, right?
Say that again?
On part two of the PDS test, it's
Yes.
talking about a description of the trauma that's bothering them.
Can you show me what you're referring to?
Sure. Do you want to see the questions, or?
Whatever you're referring to.
Let me just see if I have it marked already. All right, so you're talking about part two of the test, right?
Whatever section you're referring to, I'd like to see it.
Okay, so I'm showing you what's been marked 626, and these are the questions on part two, right?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, and the questions on part two are asking specifically about a trauma, right?
Yes.
And then we see on the answer sheet that there's room to briefly describe the traumatic event, right? Are you aware of that? Or do you need me to show?
Show me what you're talking about.
Okay. And this is Exhibit 550. We see on part two where it says briefly describe the traumatic event. You see that?
Yes.
And you see the answer is assaulted/life threatened,
Yes.
right? And according to what Jodi has said to you, Travis assaulted her, right?
Are you talking about
On
the night
June
of the
4th.
killing?
Yes.
Yes, according to what she told me.
And according to what she told you, she felt her life was threatened.
Yes.
All right, so then we go further into this test, into the actual scoring part. And now again, I guess you rescored Dr. Samuels, right?
I did.
But other than that, you've never actually done it yourself with any of your patients?
That's correct.
Okay. And at the back end, when we talk about scoring, the scoring sheet goes through A, B, C, and D, doesn't it? Do you need to see it?
Sure. Are you talking about Dr. Samuels?
I'm just talking about the PDS test. The PDS test scoring sheet, this is what we're looking at, right?
That's a hand scoring sheet, yes.
Right, it's a hand scoring sheet, and for the PDS test, right?
Yes.
And we see section A, B, C, and D, right?
Yes.
And these A, B, C, and D follow the criteria in the DSM-4, don't they? Criterion A, exposure to traumatic event.
The three that you're showing me so far, yes.
Okay. And same with D, arousal.
Yes.
Okay. And according to this PDS test, Miss Arias meets these criteria, doesn't she?
According to
According to this PDS test, she meets the criteria for A, B, C, and D.
according to the falsified traumatic event that she was referring to.
This falsified traumatic event that you want to keep talking about,
Objection. Keep talking about improper question.
Overruled.
we just established that this event, this trauma that she's talking about is when she was, again, I'm showing you the same exhibit, assaulted and her life was threatened, right?
By a stranger.
And that's going to make a difference to you.
Absolutely.
Okay, so it doesn't say stranger here, right?
That's what number 4 is?
No, I'm talking about the handwriting. It doesn't say stranger, does it?
Correct, that doesn't say stranger there.
It just says that she was assaulted and she felt her life was threatened, right?
Right.
Okay, and so if somebody's assaulted and their life is threatened by someone they know, then that's not traumatic. Is that what you're saying?
No, You're
Okay.
mischaracterizing what I'm saying.
All right, well, then you would agree that that's traumatic, right?
Ask the question again, please.
If somebody was assaulted and their life was threatened by someone they know, that would be traumatic.
It could be traumatic, yes.
Okay. And so sometimes when somebody's life is threatened, that may not be traumatic.
Right, it depends on the person's perception of it.
And their perception is that they've been assaulted and their life is threatened. That, according to you, may not cause any trauma to somebody.
It could cause a trauma, absolutely.
All right. Oh, also with regard to this PDS test, we see on the bottom, there's in a scoring sheet, and I'm showing you the same exhibit. You see the symptom severity score?
Yes,
Okay, and you see that there's a maximum of 51, right?
yes,
And the maximum of 51, if somebody is exaggerating their symptoms, they could start to reach 51, couldn't they? They can get as high as 51.
it's possible.
And even if they're not exaggerating their symptoms, it's possible for them to get to 51.
True.
But Jodi was nowhere near 51, right?
According to that sheet you just showed me, no.
Right. And that is specifically, that's not talking about whether or not she meets post-traumatic stress. That's just talking about the severity of it, right?
Correct.
And I think we've established you didn't try and give her this test yourself, right?
Correct.
Yesterday you talked some about triggering events. You remember that?
Triggering events?
Triggering events?
What specifically are you referring to?
Well, you mentioned triggering events, right?
Related to what?
Well, you mentioned triggering events as relating to that it's something that causes the PTSD.
Yes, so there's a specific event.
Okay. And you used the word triggering, didn't you?
I don't recall if I used that word in particular.
Okay. Well, triggering events really are not related to what causes the PTSD, are they? That's not the proper term, is it?
I don't understand your question. Can you say that a different way?
Sure. When in psychology and in your community, in your scientific community, when people talk about triggering events, aren't they actually talking about events that trigger responses to the trauma, triggering responses to PTSD, right?
So triggering response would be something that's, for example, a reminder of
Right.
the traumatic event, yes.
And that's how your community uses the word
Yes.
triggering, right? Your community does not use the word triggering when they're talking about a specific event or events that caused PTSD.
Events, say that again in a different way.
Your community does not use the word triggering event, when it's talking about something that is causing the PTSD.
It's possible that people use that terminology.
Okay.
Usually triggering event is thought of as a trigger of something that's happened that's a reminder of the traumatic event.
Right, okay. And you'd agree that when PTSD is diagnosed in somebody, it doesn't have to come from one specific event, does it?
It could come from any events.
Right, and in fact, it can come from either one specific event or it can come from multiple events, can it?
It can come from multiple events.
And so or it can come from the multiple events and then the final event, right? It can come from any one of those. PTSD can be diagnosed from any of those events, right?
Yes.
All right, and so that would be kind of similar to our soldiers who are coming home from the war, right? From different wars. You're aware that soldiers a lot of times are getting diagnosed with PTSD?
Yes.
And sometimes these soldiers who are getting diagnosed with PTSD, they've never actually been physically harmed themselves, have they?
Correct.
And they don't need to be physically harmed themselves to experience PTSD, do they?
Correct.
And in fact, they don't have to specifically discuss one event that they saw in a war that causes their PTSD, right?
They'll discuss many events if they were exposed to many different traumatic events where they felt like their life was in danger or they heard of someone's life being in danger and it elicited that same fear response.
Right. So they can talk about many events and they can still be diagnosed with PTSD.
Right, if their symptom presentation is actually associated to those events, yes.
Okay. All right, you're aware that Dr. Samuels did the MCMI test, right?
Yes.
All right, and the MCMI test, you did not give the MCMI test to Jodi, right?
Correct.
And the MCMI test, it basically is a tool to measure long-standing personality traits.
Correct.
It's not measuring a one-time incident, is it?
No.
This is something that you would expect not to change over time.
Right.
And the MCMI test has validity scales, doesn't it?
Yes.
And these validity scales are built into the test.
Yes.
So as a part of taking the test, you can look at these scales and say whether or not a person is answering these test questions truthfully.
Yes.
And in this MCMI test, you reviewed it, haven't you?
Yes.
And you can tell us that there's no issues with the validity with regard to MCMI.
Right. It was within the normal range.
And you looked at the base rate scores, didn't you?
Yes.
And you remember talking about that yesterday?
Yes.
All right, I'm showing you Exhibit 541. This is the MCMI-3 profile, right?
Yes.
Okay. And here we can see some of the scores, right?
Yes.
All right, so here we see anxiety, right?
Yes.
And the base rate score of that is 75.
Yes.
And at 75 even, you told us that that's clinically significant, isn't it?
Yes.
So she's elevated in anxiety, right?
Yes.
And then we have the next highest on here. We have PTSD, don't we? Which is the scale at 69, right?
Yes.
And so while that doesn't hit 75, it's an elevated scale, right?
Yes.
It's above normal,
Yes.
and it's far above normal, isn't it?
It's above. Yes, it's still below the clinical significance.
Okay. And yesterday you told us when things are below the clinical significance, you don't just throw that away, do you?
Correct.
So it's still something, a data point, as you would say, that you would consider, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And so the two highest scales on the MCMI, right, we have anxiety and PTSD, don't we?
Yes.
The other thing, let's look at two more scales, actually. Let's look at desirability. You see desirability, that's another higher score, right, 67?
Yes.
And desirability is what?
I believe that's a scale to present yourself in a desirable way, overly desirable way.
Okay, so in other words, so she's ranking high in a scale that means that she wants to present herself as desirable in a better way.
Yes.
Right? And so when somebody is trying to present themselves in a more desirable or a better way, it might even be possible that the anxiety and the PTSD are being minimized here, right? Because she's trying to make herself look better.
Not in this case because it didn't reach the threshold.
So you would ignore it then?
It doesn't reach the validity threshold. So at that point, if she had passed over 75, then we would look at it and say it's impacting her scores, but it's not thought to impact her scores at this rate.
Okay, so basically you're throwing it away then?
It doesn't pass the validity, yeah, it doesn't pass the threshold.
Yeah, okay, so
Yes.
you're throwing it away because it's below 75?
Yes.
All right, even though you just told us that you don't throw data away just because it goes below 75.
Well, those were the other scales that talk about her personality rather than the validity. The goal of the validity scales are to tell us, can we trust the test or not?
Mm-hmm.
That's the goal of it, and it's telling us that we can trust the test.
Okay, so it causes you no concern whatsoever then that she scores very high, elevated, not clinically, but elevated on the desirability, right? That doesn't mean anything to you.
I'm not saying it doesn't mean anything. I'm saying that it doesn't cross that threshold that makes me concerned about the validity of the test.
Okay. All right, let's look at one more scale. Let's look at borderline. And we're talking about thresholds so much, and I know we were talking about ones in the 60s, but the borderline personality trait here, we see a base of 11, right?
Yes,
That is far below even normal, isn't it?
that's below.
Far below normal, right?
Below the clinical significance, just like all the rest.
Right, so when we talk about desirability or when we talk about PTSD being below the clinical significance, those are both 60s, so they're just a few off of 75, aren't they?
Right, but you're trying to put a value on something by you're making it subjective by talking about it in that manner. The way this maintains as this objective test is by using the criteria that's set forth in the manual. So anything below 75 is considered to be not significant.
Okay, so borderline, you'd agree then, is not significant?
Right, on this test, it came up below the significance level.
Not significant,
Not
right?
significant.
All right, you also, let's see, you did the actually, you're not finished with that. And you're aware that the MCMI-3, when it's scored, that comes with a comprehensive report, right?
Yes,
Did you review that as part of your review in this case?
he did not give that to me.
Okay, so you don't have
Dr.
it.
Samuels did not offer that to me.
All right. Judge, may I approach? I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 625.
Objection, Rule 15 violation.
Approach, please. We're going to take a 10-minute recess. Please be back in the designated area at 10 minutes after 11. Please remember the admonition. You are excused. The record will show the jury has left the courtroom. You may step down. We are at recess.